So tonight I want to talk about Eretz Yisrael, the Holy Land, the Promised Land. Sometimes we use these various terms interchangeably. Eretz Yisrael, we might say the Holy Land, we might say the Promised Land, but it's worth considering a bit. Are these actually the same thing? The Promised Land, the Holy Land, Eretz Yisrael, are they exactly the same? And a related question, what makes the Holy Land holy in the first place? Is it a property of the land or something else? Or a different angle, a related question, what makes this land so special? And what makes it so special to us? Okay, so this is a set of topics, a big set of topics, not something that we're going to be able to nail down in one sitting. And admittedly, within our tradition, there are a range of perspectives on the topic or this set of topics. So it's not like there's a single answer, but it seems like it's important enough that we should at least start somewhere. So the idea of tonight's shiur is really to start thinking about a big topic. And what we'll do is, as always, we'll go through some sources together to help us, think about the topic, not to nail it down, but to at least give us some sources that we can use to relate to this set of questions. So again, we're going to think about what we mean when we talk about the Promised Land, when we talk about the Holy Land, when we talk about Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so where to start? So often in our Jewish learning, when we want to get down to basics, we turn to Rashi. And then as we go deeper, we eventually find ourselves learning the Rambam. Okay, so that's going to be our game plan from tonight. We're going to start with a Rashi and we'll wind up with a Rambam. And the very first Rashi in the Torah begins with Rashi quoting the famous question of Rabbi Yitzchak, which is, why does the Torah start with all of these stories about creation and the flood and on and on? If the Torah is a book of laws, shouldn't it have started with the first law? HaChodesh hazeh lachem. Okay, so that's Rabbi Yitzchak's question, as quoted by Rashi. Why didn't the Torah just start with the first mitzvah, HaChodesh hazeh lachem? And Rashi answers as follows. He says, She'im yomru umot haolam liYisrael. So if the nations of the world were to say to Bnei Yisrael, listimatem, you are thieves, shekavashtem artzot shiv'a goyim, because you conquered the land of the seven nations. Hem omrim lahem, the Jews would be, Bnei Yisrael would be able to respond to their accusers, their non-Jewish accusers, kol haaretz shel hakadosh baruch hu. All of the land belongs to Hashem, to God. Hu bra'ah, he created it, u'netana le'asher yashar be'einav, and he gave it to whoever he saw fit. Birtzono natan lahem, by his will it was given to them, these seven nations that preceded us in the first place. Birtzono netala mehem u'netana lan, and by his will it was taken from them and given to us. Okay, this is a famous Rashi. And we all learn this Rashi when we're kids. But let's unpack it a little bit now that we're adults. So keep in mind the context of the times within which Rashi lived. Rashi lived in the 11th century in France, and he lived during the time of the First Crusade, when Christians from Europe, and in particular Christians from Rashi's native France, decided to march on the Holy Land and reclaim it from its Muslim conquerors. Okay, the Christian crusaders came to take the Holy Land by force. And so with that background, it's just interesting to think that here we have the first Rashi in the Torah, whose message is that the nations of the world will essentially apply a double standard when it comes to the Jewish people. So they'll accuse us of being thieves, of stealing the land by force, even as they themselves muster their armies to conquer the Holy Land by force. That's the double standard that will be applied to us. And so in the context of Rashi's life, his first comment on the entire Torah is particularly poignant. Essentially, Rashi says, sure, you can go over there and you can fight over the Holy Land. But in the end, the land is really ours. And it's ours in a way that's more powerful than the sword. Regardless of who wins in your wars and in your crusades, the land that you're fighting for truly belongs to us. And no amount of military force can take that away from us. Okay, so that's one way of thinking about what that first Rashi, something that maybe stands behind that first Rashi. And so this first Rashi in the Torah essentially highlights two important points about our claim to the land, which we're going to see tonight over and over again. So the first point is that we know and we fully acknowledge that we weren't always in control of the land of Israel. We weren't the first ones there, and there were periods when we were kicked off the land and we struggled to get back. Okay, all that's true. That's one point made by Rashi. We came from somewhere else. Nevertheless, the second point, our claim to the land is deeply just. It is, right? In fact, it's more just than the claims of others, many others, who have also tried to make a claim to the same land and to conquer it and to rule over it. Okay, and both of these are important points. So let's look at each of them on its own. So to the first point, that we weren't the first people to live in what we now call the land of Israel. Okay, that we weren't always there. Okay, that point is made so many times in the Torah that it seems clear that the Torah itself wants us to understand it. The Torah goes out of its way to point out that our ancestors were not originally from the land that would eventually become Eretz Yisrael, right? So Abraham came from elsewhere, from Ur-Kasdim, right? We tell the story, Arami Oved Avi, my forefather was a wandering Aramean, okay? We don't originate, or at least Abraham does not come from the land of Israel, okay? Our people also lived for hundreds of years as slaves in Egypt before we entered the land. Bnei Yisrael are not originally from Eretz Yisrael, you might say, okay? And the land isn't called the land of Canaan, Eretz Canaan, in the Torah for nothing. Again, the Torah has no, illusions about this. The Canaani were there before Bnei Israel, and they were there before Abraham got there. The Torah doesn't shy away from that. But the Torah also makes clear, and maybe this is part of the point, that your presence in a certain place is not on its own sufficient to cement your claim to that land. A claim to the land is not as simple as saying finders keepers, losers weepers. Okay, why? In part, this is because, and the Torah points this out as well, no nation ever really got there first. Even for the most ancient peoples, there was always someone there before you. So for example, the Torah points out that with regard to Moab and Edom, it specifically tells us that they, even though we think of the land of Moab or the land of Edom, they also came there later in the story. About the land of Moab, the Torah tells us that there were a people before them called the Amim. And similarly, when it comes to the people of Edom and the land in Seir and the land of Edom, they apparently displaced an older people called the Hori. Okay, so basically, if you look back far enough, everyone came from somewhere else. Okay, your claim to the land depends on more than just your being there. Yeah, it depends on your being. It's helpful to be there. It depends when you got there. It depends how you got there. And the Torah points out it depends what you did while you were on the land, because that matters as well, because you can actually lose your claim to the land. Okay, so that's kind of this first point that flows from Rashi, that we recognize, the Torah recognizes that we came from somewhere else. Nevertheless, the second point is that our claim to the land is just, and the way that Rashi explains it is that it's based on a divine promise. Okay, so let's think about that piece of it, the kind of our claim from that perspective. So Rashi's pointing out, you might say, that the quality of your claim to the land is important. Again, because multiple peoples might claim the same land. And we sometimes have to adjudicate between multiple claims to the same land, right? The Rashi is saying that the nations of the world will come to us and say, no, your claim is no good. Our claim is better, let's say. So anyways, it matters what is the source of your claim. And there are certain normal types of arguments that most nations use when they explain when they justify their territorial claims. So, for example, the simplest is, we won this land, and so now it's ours. That's a common one. Or, we're here already, so you go somewhere else. Okay? We're here, just try to make us leave, otherwise it's ours. Okay, these are all variants on a theme, right? Essentially, again, maybe a silly, but not too silly way of saying it is finders, keepers, losers, weepers. It's ours to the extent that we took it from someone and you can't take it from us. Okay? But Jewish history is not normal, and our claim to the land is not normal. That's not how we explain our connection to the land at all. For a whole bunch of reasons that we all know, our strange little people managed to maintain our connection to a place for thousands of years, even after we were forcibly exiled from that land. Somehow we never lost faith that one day we would return. And so our claim is not based on our being on the land at all times, not being original, not being there at all times. It's based on something else. Okay, it's an unusual type of claim. And that connectedness of a people who we know never gave up on the promise of returning to their land, despite all odds, really quite unprecedented. And it's so unusual that you might say that you could think of it as being outside of history, beyond the norms of history. You might say that it's something miraculous. Okay, and that's one way of thinking about what we mean when we say that the land is ours by way of a divine promise. You almost can't explain our level of connection to the land without it being divine, miraculous, again, just outside the range of normal. It seems deeper than normal, right? And so in that sense, our claim goes beyond normal because the entire history of the Jewish people is not normal. And so, again, getting back to Rashi around 1,000 years ago realized that the nations of the world will not want to recognize our claim. They'll call us thieves for taking someone else's land, even as they themselves go to try to take that same land. And so sadly, when we show up with our claim, they'll reject us and they'll misunderstand us because our connection to the land, you might say, is different, and at least we would think of it as being deeper than anything that they can understand from their own experiences. Okay, that's some introductory thoughts about the first Rashi in the Torah and our connection to the land of Israel. Okay, now let's shift gears a little bit. There's going to be kind of a few different puzzle pieces before we get to the Rambam. Let's think a little bit more about what we mean when we say the promised land, the land that Hashem promised us. So again, this also is a little bit more complicated than we might at first realize. So the Torah, as we know, in a number of places describes God's promise of the land to the Avot, to our forefathers. And when you read those passages, you can't help but notice that the land that is promised in those promises to the Avot is slightly different than what we usually think of as Eretz Yisrael. So, for example, we read in Parshat Lech Lecha, Brit Ben Abtarim, that God promises to Avraham, to your offspring I assign this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. This is obviously a much larger area than the land that we think of as the land of Israel, potentially including the Sinai, parts of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, maybe even parts of Iraq, right? From the Nile to the Euphrates. It's just a different thing than what we think of as Eretz Yisrael. And similarly in Shemot, in Parshat Mishpatim, Hashem says, I'll set your borders from the Sea of Reeds, from the Yam Suf, to the Sea of the Plishtim, and from the Midbar, from the wilderness, again, to the Euphrates. So again, there's a much larger territory than what we think of normally as Eretz Yisrael. And similarly, again, in the book of Devarim, Moshe tells Bnei Israel Hashem's description of the land that will be given to Bnei Israel, and again, spanning from the Mediterranean to the Euphrates, including the Negev and Lebanon. So the promised land, you might say, in these psukim, over and over, is far larger than anything that we think of as Eretz Yisrael. So it's worth noticing that. But on the other hand, when you look at the parts of Tanakh, when the theory was actually put into practice, not just the promised land, but the land actually given to Bnei Israel, we see something different. When the tribal territories in the land were actually divided up in the book of Bamidbar, and then again in the book of Yehoshua, when Bnei Israel actually enter the land and the boundaries of the tribal areas are given, that land is far more modest. The land given to the 12 tribes is much more similar to what we tend to think of as Eretz Yisrael. It's smaller than the promised land, you might say. But anyways, so what constitutes Eretz Yisrael? Is it the more expansive area described in the promises made to the Avot, or is it a more modest area that was actually allocated to the tribes and where Bnei Israel lived in practice? Okay, bottom line is there seems to be a difference between, you might say, the potential more expansive borders of Eretz Yisrael and the actual borders of Eretz Yisrael. There's a kind of a broader promise which perhaps sets the outside theoretical bounds, or maybe the extent of the regional sphere of influence that we would have. But anyways, there's a narrower part of the land where we actually settled, where we actually took ownership and built Jewish society, where we actually put the promise into practice, you could say. And the area that we actually settled in is what actually became Eretz Yisrael. Yeah, not the theoretically larger promised land, some of which we never actually settled in or controlled. And it's interesting, just on this point, that the Torah itself seems careful to hold this distinction. So the term Eretz Yisrael is never used in the Torah itself, in the 5 books. Even as all the promises are made by Hashem, the term Eretz Yisrael is absent, right? When the land was just a promise, it was not yet Eretz Yisrael. That term only starts showing up in Nevi'im and Ketuvim. It's only used in the books that deal with the periods after Bnei Israel actually arrived in the land and settled in the land. And you could say that we find out what Eretz Yisrael is, not based just on the promises made before, but again, based on the practice of where we actually built our society. At that point, Am Yisrael settled in Eretz Yisrael. And at that point, the promised land becomes, again, the kind of Eretz Yisrael, our land. Okay, so again, another piece of the puzzle that we need to keep in mind before we get to the Rambam. One more important concept from Tanakh, again, as a puzzle piece that will help us. So there's a story in the book of Shoftim, in the 11th chapter, about a shofet named Yiftach HaGiladi. And that tells the story of a defensive war that Yiftach fights against the people of Ammon. And the people of Ammon have been attacking Bnei Israel. And Yiftach, it's time, we have to fight back and defend ourselves. And Yiftach, before he goes to war, actually attempts to avoid war, you might say through diplomacy. So what he does is he goes to the king of Ammon, he sends a message to the king of Ammon, and he says, why have you come up against me to make war on my country? Okay, it says, Ma li velach kivata elai leilachem be'artzi. Why have you come to fight against my land? And the king of Ammon replies, and he gives a very interesting answer. He says, I'm fighting with Bnei Israel to right a past wrong. And the people of Ammon give the following explanation. He says, when you guys came up from Egypt, you stole some of our land. And Yiftach replies to set the record straight. He says, first of all, Bnei Israel didn't take any land from the people of Ammon. Right? He says, let's get history straight. It's true, says Yiftach, that when we first came up in the days of Moshe, we did conquer various lands, including some land from the Emori, which we know we read about in the book of Dvarim, that we beat the king Sichon and we take his land. We're told that Sichon came out against us in war and we defeated him and we wind up conquering his land at that time. Okay, so Yiftach says it's true that we took land from the Emori. And it's true that some of the land that we conquered from the Emori is land that they had actually previously conquered from you, the people of Ammon. But we didn't take anything from you directly, says Yiftach. If you have a beef, take it up with the Emori. We took your land from you in the first place. Okay, we kind of fought against those guys when they came out against us. But your claim was long in the past. And secondly, Yiftach says, and this is crucial, he says, in all of those years since we beat the Emori and we've been living on this land, for more than 300 years. You never came to us and said that the land is ours, right? You, Ammon, never came to us and made a claim against us over this land. And now suddenly, when it suits you, after all these years, when you're raiding us and attacking us, when it suits you to try to say, why are you attacking us in the land of Israel? You point to that piece of land and you say, well, I'm really fighting you over that piece over there that you stole from me. Yiftach says, don't give me any excuses now that you're attacking me now to right a wrong that's 300 years old or so, which you never showed any interest in at all those years in between. Okay, don't give me a fake reason for why you're attacking us. It's really amazing, to see Yiftach, as we're told in the book of Shoftim, a biblical judge, one of the Shoftim, engaging in diplomacy over land. You might even say engaging in what we would today call hasbara, potentially, but it's certainly diplomacy. He's trying to set the record straight and say the history of the land actually matters for understanding where we are today and for adjudicating between your claim and ours. Okay, and the message from this story in the book of Shoftim seems to be that it's true that the vanquished people who lose their land retain a certain rightful claim to the land from which they were dispossessed. In principle, it seems Yiftach acknowledges that is true. And that means that conquest alone does not determine ownership. But to retain your claim, the vanquished have to continue to make their claim. To retain their claim, they have to continue to make their claim whenever they have the chance, meaning that if the vanquished don't continue to yearn for the land that they lost, if they don't continue to show their connectedness to that land, then their claim goes stale. Basically, if you want the land that you no longer control to be yours, you have to act like it is still yours. And this is an argument that Yiftach is making to the people of Ammon. The implication seems to be that the argument is kind of good enough that even a non-Jewish king, should, at least in principle, be able to respect it. Though, of course, Ammon in the story does not actually, buy into Yiftach's argument. Okay, so these were a bunch of kind of building blocks. Now, with that background, we're ready to read a famous Rambam where he discusses the sanctity of the land of Israel. Okay, Kedushat Eretz Yisrael. So the Rambam in the 6th chapter of Hilchot Beit HaBechira weighs in on a sugya that comes up a number of times in the Gemara, which is whether the Kedusha, whether the holiness of Eretz Yisrael is eternal or whether it's temporary. So in halachic terminology, this is the sugya of whether the land is, whether it's kidsha lashata, whether it is a temporary sanctity of the land, or if it's kidsha le'atid lavo, or whether it's an eternal sanctity, whether it's sanctified indefinitely. And this question sounds kind of funny to us, that this is even a sugya. Basically, the Gemara wonders in a number of places, effectively, is the Holy Land always holy? And what determines the shape and the borders of the Holy Land? What land exactly is holy? And are the borders of the Holy Land fixed? Or can they change over time? That's basically what this sugya is about. And there are a number of different statements across Shas that seem to imply that different parts of the land of Israel may have had different levels of status as holy or not holy at different times in Jewish history. And meaning that it seems, when you look at some of these sources, that there isn't just a plot of land that you look at and you say, yep, that's the Holy Land. But rather, these Gemaras seem to imply that some parts of the land may have been holy at one time and not holy at another time in history. Or some places might have been treated as Eretz Yisrael and then maybe not been treated as Eretz Yisrael, again, at different times in Jewish history. Basically, the boundaries of the Holy Land, well, generally unchanging, but we're not always fixed, okay? And this seems odd. Again, this seems very strange to our ears. Isn't the Holy Land always holy? Like, what does that even mean? But that is what this sugya is about, okay? And so both the Gemara itself and the Rishonim who follow, and everyone since, offer various solutions to try to make sense of these various statements in a systematic way, to resolve these different statements of the Gemara or discussions in the Gemara. What land exactly is the Holy Land? And holy for what purpose? And holy for all time or holy only for a limited amount of time? Okay, so again, that's the background. We're not going to go through all of those various, sources, but that's what this sugya is about, broadly speaking. Okay, so the Rambam, now the Rambam takes an interesting and novel approach. And let's go through it inside, and then we'll unpack it. So let me get it up on screen. We'll go through it, and then we will unpack it. Okay, so the Rambam says, "V'lama ani omer b'mikdash v'Yerushalayim kedusha rishona kedusha latid lavo." Why is it that I say that when it comes to the Beit HaMikdash and Yerushalayim, that its original holiness, its original sanctification, meaning at the time of the original conquest of the land in the days of Yehoshua, in the days of the first, leading up to Bayit Rishon, in that period, why is that Kadsha Le'atid Lavo, that it's eternal, that it goes on forever? Uvikdushat Shar Eretz Yisrael, but when it comes to the rest of the land of Israel, Le'inyan Shvi'it, U'Masrot, V'Kayotze Bahem, Lo Kadsha Le'atid Lavo. At least with respect to the laws of Shemitah and Maser and various laws that have to do with the land, that at least with respect to that, the holiness of the land was temporary. It was not for eternity. Okay. And so, basically, outside of Yerushalayim, Rambam says that the holiness of the Holy Land and the designation of Eretz Yisrael was not something that lasted forever, starting from the days of the original conquest of the land. Okay, so now let's see why. So he says, Lefi, Shekdushat Hamikdash Yerushalayim Mipnei Hashchina. Says that the sanctification of the Beit HaMikdash and of Yerushalayim, its source is the Shechina, is the divine presence. U'Shechina eina b'tela. And the divine presence is something that never goes away. V'harehu omer, and then he quotes a pasuk. Okay, basically, I'm not going to, just in the interest of time, we're not going to go through that drasha. Okay, Ava. Chiyuv haaretz b'shvi'it v'masrot eino ela mifnei shehu kibush rabim. But in contrast to what Rambam says, what I told you about Yerushalayim, that its sanctification comes from the presence of the Shekhinah. When it comes to these laws of the land, treating the land as holy with respect to, again, Shemitah and Maser, these laws that involve the way that we use the land, okay? The holiness with respect to these things is only because of, he says, Kibush Rabbi, because it was a mass conquest. Okay, Vekevan, meaning that Bnei Israel, when they entered the land under Yehoshua, when they first came into the land, they conquered it by force. Vekevan shenichleka haaretz midehem, and because later on, just like they conquered the land, they themselves were conquered, and the land was taken from them. But tal hakibush, their conquest was nullified. V'niftera mina Torah mimasrot u'mishvi'it shaharei eina min Eretz Yisrael. And once they were conquered, the land was no longer, you could say, the Holy Land for the purposes of these laws of the land. Why? Because we had the land taken from us in the same way as we had taken it from someone else. And at that point, it was no longer Eretz Yisrael. It's an amazing line. Okay, and then he goes onward. So Vekevan she'ala Ezra vekidsha lo kidsha bekivush ela bechazaka shechizikuba. Says, and when in the days of Ezra, when Bnei Israel returned from the first exile in Babylonia, the sanctification in the days of Ezra upon their return was not a sanctification of conquest. Rather, it was a sanctification due to, I'm not even going to translate it quite yet, but chazakah, or maybe I'll just say by now possession or settlement. Okay, it's something different. It's as chazakah as opposed to kibush. Okay, possession or settlement as opposed to conquest. Ulefikach, and therefore, kol makom shehziku ba olei Bavel v'nitkadesh bikdushat Ezra hashniya, and therefore all of the places that they returned to in the days of Ezra, the second time, hu mekudash hayom, that remains sanctified today. That afal pi shenilkach haaretz mimenu, even though the land was again taken away from us, even so, it's still treated for all of these purposes as holy land forever, even to our day. Okay, let me stop sharing. That's a very interesting Rambam. Now let's try to just unpack, in light of some of the things that we learned before, what Rambam might be saying. Again, let's start from the beginning. Rambam makes an important distinction. He says that the sanctity of Jerusalem is eternal. Jerusalem remains, Yerushalayim is a holy city with Jews or without Jews. Har HaBayit, right, the Temple Mount is holy, whether we have a Beit HaMikdash on it or not. In theory, actually, he says, you could offer sacrifices on Har HaBayit, whether the temple is standing or not. The holiness of Yerushalayim and of Har HaBayit, says Rambam, is based on the Shekhinah, on the divine presence. It's a uniquely holy place, whether Jews are there or not. But, as opposed to that, when it comes to the rest of the land of Israel, Rambam lays out a historical chronology. He says that when the generation of Mitzrayim entered the land, their claim was based on conquest. They came with an army, they won battles under Yehoshua, they moved in by force, and therefore, when Bnei Israel were in turn displaced via conquest by others, basically by the Assyrians who conquered the northern kingdom of Yisrael, and by the Babylonians who conquered the southern kingdom of Yehudah later on, we lost the land. It was no longer Eretz Yisrael, and it lost its sanctity. It actually lost its kedusha. And then Rambam says that when Bnei Israel returned to the land in the days of Ezra, they returned from exile. They claimed the land in a totally different way, not based on military conquest, but rather based on chazaka. Okay, we'll have to explain what exactly that means. Again, possession or settlement or something like that. Let's say possession. They took possession of it, but they didn't conquer it. And that kind of sanctity that came with the generation of Ezra, with chazaka, says Rambam, is something that can't be undone ever. Okay, that kind of sanctity is eternal. So since the times of Ezra's return, the land has been holy forever. And specifically, and here's kind of the interesting point, specifically the portions of the land that Ezra and the people of his time returned to, which actually was not exactly the same land that Olei Mitzrayim had returned to. So that land and only that land became defined as Eretz Yisrael eternally and forever. That's Rambam's position as laid out in the Mishnah Torah, as we read. And there have been many attempts to explain this Rambam. And in all honesty, its meaning is not entirely clear, even as you read through it. Okay? So there are different ways of interpreting it. And we haven't even explained really what chazaka is. Okay, so but what is the special mechanism of our claim that somehow in the days of Ezra was so much better than our original claim? Okay, so again, there are different ways to read this Rambam, but here's one approach. When the generation of Mitzrayim, when the generation of Yehoshua and the original conquest of the land took place, they were acting like a normal nation in that respect. As we discussed before, normal nations consolidate power over a certain piece of land, often by force, and they claim that land as their own. And normal nations live on their land until someone bigger and stronger comes along and defeats them. And when that happens, they typically disappear. Again, finders, keepers, losers, weepers. Okay, that's what happened to Ammon. That's what happened to Moab. That's what happened to all the surrounding kingdoms, which no longer exist. That's what happened to the Assyrians and to the Babylonians, which may have conquered us, but they were conquered by someone later on, and they no longer exist. That's what happened to all the regional powers and empires who came and went in this land. Their claim to the land was only as good as their staying power. And maybe, says Rambam, at least according to this reading, during the first Commonwealth, during the days of Bayit Rishon, you might have seen Bnei Israel as just a normal nation in its claim to the land in this way. Okay, they came, they saw, they conquered, they flourished for a time, but ultimately they were defeated, just like most nations ultimately are. And so their time on the land and the kedusha associated with their time on the land was temporary. It lasted as long as they did on the land. But it's not the end of the story, because then Bnei Israel did something that was truly unique, something truly special and unusual during the generation of Ezra. And that is that astonishingly, Bnei Israel, at least some of them, returned to the land of Israel, the land from which they had been exiled 70 years before, and they rebuilt the Beit HaMikdash. And they began a renewed period of Jewish life in the land of Israel, the period of Bayit Sheni, that lasted for more than 500 years. And that was something truly unprecedented in world history. People exiled off their land who just came back, who never gave up and actually came back. And by doing so, the Jews showed their attachment to the land was not temporary. It was eternal. And maybe this is why that second claim to the land via chazaka, which again means possession rather than conquest, is so much more powerful, because that undeterred claim to the land, even after Bnei Israel were kicked off of it, showed that Bnei Israel had never stopped being its owner. As soon as they had a chance to go back, they did. Chazaka basically means acting in a way that displays your ownership. You prove and this is true not just in Jewish law, but more broadly, you prove your ownership sometimes by acting as if you are the owner. You prove your ownership by acting as its owner publicly. We would say in American law, notoriously, right in everyone's face. You treat something as your property, and if nobody else disputes it for a certain amount of time, it is your property. And that's true in Jewish law more generally. So the Mishnah in Kiddushin tells us that real estate is acquired in one of three ways: by kesef, by purchasing land for money; by shtar, by a purchase contract; or by chazaka, by possession, by just being on the land and treating it as if you are the owner for a certain period of time. And the Gemara, of course, follows up and explains that what chazaka means and what its bounds are. But basically, again, you prove your ownership by possessing land openly, by acting like an owner in a public way. So, nations and empires generally, they show up, they conquer, and they disappear. That's the normal way of things. What's unique about our history is that we persisted, and our claim to the land persisted. We continued to long for the land even after we were conquered, and in that way, we acted upon our claim in a way that shows chazaka. It shows that we retained our ownership in a way that was eternal. Okay, so okay. Another way to think about this, or another kind of way that we see it in the Torah, a similar theme. There are three cities in the land of Israel that we are told in Tanakh that our forefathers purchased for money. So the three cities are: Avraham bought land in Hebron, right? We just read that in Parshat Chayei Sarah, that he buys Marat HaMachpelah for 400 shekel. So, silver, 400 silver shekel, okay? And so that's the first plot of land that the Avot bought. The second is Yaakov. Yaakov, we are told, bought land in Shechem. It says the parcel of land where he pitched his tent, he purchased from the family of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 kesita. Okay, so that's the second place that we're told that one of the Avot bought land. The third is David HaMelech. David HaMelech bought land in Yerushalayim. Actually, he bought the land where the Beit HaMikdash would later be built by his son Shlomo. As we're told in the book of Shmuel Bet, David bought the threshing floor of Aravna for 50 shekels of silver. Okay, so 3 examples where our ancestors are said to have bought land in Israel. And you might have thought that the fact that our forefathers bought that land is the source of our claim. That almost like their receipt on the land, if you showed it, is what makes it ours. But I don't think that's exactly the case. It's part of the story, but it isn't the whole story. Because in each case, you might say what really solidified our claim to the city was not the fact that one of the Avot bought it originally, but rather that generations later we returned to it. In each one of these cities, there's a story of return. So in the case of Hebron, sure, Avraham bought the land, but years later, it was the fact that his grandson Yaakov, who dies in Egypt, but nevertheless tells his children, please bury me in Hebron, in Marat HaMachpelah. It's Yaakov's insistence that his body be returned to Hebron is what makes Avram's original purchase of Marat HaMachpelah not just a temporary purchase, not just as good as his receipt, but something that's really eternal and lasting. Okay? And similarly, when it comes to Shechem, we're told in the book of Yoshua that the bones of Yosef, which Bnei Israel brought up from Egypt, were buried in Shechem. It says, in the piece of ground that Yaakov had bought for 100 ksita from the children of Hamor. So again, it stresses that Yosef, like his father, shows his children that he never gave up thinking of Shechem as his real home. And that is what makes that claim so powerful. Not just that his father had bought the land, but that he insisted that he return to the land. And similarly, in the case of Yerushalayim, we all know after the Babylonian exile, as soon as Cyrus, king of Persia, allowed the Jews to return and build the temple, they did. So again, ultimately, our claim to these places is a combination of 2 things. One, the fact that we were once there, of course, but also the fact that even when we weren't there, we always yearned to return to those places, and that we did return generations later. Okay, so let's just recap, because we've seen a lot. Let's recap where we've been today. We started with Rashi, who pointed out that our claim to land is different than the claims of normal nations. And he warned that the nations of the world would impose a double standard on us. They'd reject our claim to the Holy Land, even as they themselves fought to take the Holy Land. They'd reject our claim because our claim is so foreign to them, you might say, because we and our history are so foreign to them. Okay. And then we noted that there's a difference in the Torah between the promised land and the land of Israel, between the much larger potential borders of Eretz Yisrael and the actual, in practice, borders of Eretz Yisrael. Because Eretz Yisrael is not defined by the promise, but rather by the actual, by the places where we actually lived, where we actually built our society. And then next, we noted the story of the diplomatic story of Yiftach HaGiladi, who told the people of Ammon that if they wanted to maintain their claim as a vanquished people, vanquished from their land that they once controlled, that's fine. But to do that, they had to show an enduring claim in a sustained way. And you show your enduring connection to land by actively showing that you never give up on it, even when you're separated from it. And all that was to help us think about this famous Rambam, where he says that the holiness of Yerushalayim and the Har HaBayit are eternal, whether we're there or not, but the holiness of the rest of the land is dependent on us. It's dependent essentially on our actions. It is our returning to the land after years of exile, despite all odds, at least in this reading, that made the land Kidsha La'atid Lavo, eternally holy. At that point, it became not just the promised land, not just a land with a lot of promise, but rather Eretz Yisrael, eternal. Okay, and that's important because sometimes we talk about the Holy Land like it's some fixed thing waiting for us to just discover it. Like the holiness is like a property of the soil. And again, there are different traditions within, there are different voices within our tradition. But certainly if you sampled the soil in a lab, right, it's not like you would say, yep, this is the holy stuff, okay? It doesn't necessarily work that way, or at least in the Rambam's explanation, it seems that the holiness of the land comes at the meeting point of where the potential holiness that Hashem created through his promises to our forefathers is translated into actual holiness through our return, as we kind of talked about in all that detail. And it helps to keep in mind that, as Rambam pointed out, the holiness of Yerushalayim is different than the holiness of the rest of Eretz Yisrael. The holiness of Yerushalayim is inherent. It would be a holy place, even if there wasn't a Jew in the world to appreciate that holiness. As Rambam puts it, the Shekhinah resides there, right? The city has a transcendent holiness beyond anything that we can do to add or detract from it. In fact, even if the whole city wasn't there, even if the city sits in ruins, still Yerushalayim is a special place, with or without us, okay? But the holiness of the rest of Eretz Yisrael is in part, it seems, dependent on us. And so I think that that is a beautiful thought, that part of what makes the land, part of what makes the Holy Land holy, part of what makes it Eretz Yisrael is the way that we act, the way the Jewish people act. The holiness emerges, you might say, in the places where we build and practice on places that were only promised before we got there. Okay, so I'm going to leave off with that.